Like personally, my thing that I'm interested in the Edda is that the Æsir are obviously mortal. They've got some kind of, Ithun's apples that keep them alive as soon as the Æsir tricks Loki or blackmails Loki into letting him grab the lady. Then they all start getting old and grey really fast. And that to me is quite, because I'm getting older and greyer, I sort of can feel that, like just how horrifying it would be to go from being beautiful and 20 to suddenly being 60 something. And
they also have flying machines, like they have eagle shapes or bird
yeah,
shapes. That are a kind of flying machines, and especially the one that Freya has. You can borrow it from her.
it's so good to see you. I've really enjoyed our conversations by email, and
Yes.
very kind of you to give me some of your time. I'm so looking forward to coming to Iceland. Long-term dream.
When did you first get to know Iceland and Icelandic?
Um, well, I sort of discovered the Viking Age in 1973 when I was about 15,
Yeah.
and then just was so enthusiastic about it. My school library didn't have any Viking books, and the librarian said to me, I was always hiding from the bullies in there,
Yeah.
and the librarian said to me, Dave, you're a smart guy. Is there any books you'd like to see? And I said, well, yeah, I really like the Vikings. I've just discovered them. So she gave me this book, and she said, pick as many as you want. So, I picked about 10. And then later she says, you can pick more. And so I filled the library up with these Viking Age books, scholarly books and fiction. And then 1976, I discovered that Icelanders pretty much can, speak Old Norse, can read Old Norse. I was very amazed by that. And I bought my Linguaphone course that year. I've still got it. It's got the old, black records, and very difficult way to learn a language from the other side of the world when no one even knows where Iceland is. But
Yeah.
it's just been a fun hobby over all those years. But I've met Icelanders along the way and had some fun. And
Yes. And it must be much easier with the internet,
oh,
like studying distant things.
it's a whole new world for me, and in a way, it's good because I gave up my study of Icelandic. I should be ashamed to say this, but I spent about 15 years studying Japanese.
Mm.
And then when COVID came along, I said to my wife, look, I've really, really got to do something with this Icelandic. I'm sick of this thing hanging on for, 40 something years.
Yeah.
And the internet made all the difference. And I began to be able to watch Icelandic TV. And I remember seeing you talking to Jackson Crawford. And I think it was just
Yeah.
after that I wrote to you. I thought,
Yeah.
I wonder if this distinguished gentleman will speak to me. And you're just a nice man, and you did. And
Yeah.
so
So
I've
yeah.
really, so I really want to know, and for my audience on my channel, it's called Viking Superpowers, and I have told you a fair bit about it, I think, but obviously I'm interested in everything to do with the Viking Age and with Icelandic language and Old Norse and the sagas, but I've been getting into the Edda and looking for the paranormal, going to that extent of finding what I think is perhaps paleo contact, sort of aliens or some kind of advanced humans in the ancient days who could have been the Æsir, the Olds. And when I first read this, which I'm proud to say I finally got it in print, turned up a couple of days ago, The Troll Inside You, Paranormal Activity in the Medieval North. I've read it a couple of times. I think about it all the time. So I wanted to use this time to ask you about how you got into this subject. Like, first off, how you got into studying Old Icelandic and got into your academic career.
Well, I always did really well in school in Icelandic. So when I picked the topic as my university field, it wasn't really Old Icelandic I was interested in. It was more like modern Icelandic literature and linguistics, no less actually. And there was a time I was thinking of also at least pursuing a career in historical linguistics, which I found fascinating. But when I was studying, I kind of realized that Old Norse or Old Icelandic has this international community that most of the other parts don't really have. So it's studied all over the world, Australia included, and New Zealand. And I thought this was a way to study your own language that you know best, but still get to travel the world, meet people, be a part of a really international community. And I think this instinct was the right one, because it's my life has been spent getting to know foreigners way more than it otherwise would have been. And when it comes to the paranormal, I think I just began like everyone begins, studying the words, looking at various designations of the paranormal, dwarves and elves and things like that. And of course, I was a reader of Tolkien and very interested in these paranormal creatures. And it wasn't until I came to the trolls that I realized how important language is, and that the definition of troll that I had grown up with was in fact not that prominent in the Middle Ages. And this was hardly a new discovery, except for me. It was a personal discovery rather than a scholarly discovery. But I did see that what had happened was a constriction, semantic constriction, that the word troll had always meant what it does today, but it had also meant various other things, and they were more prominent, in particular magic creatures, and you can say both magic practitioners and things that have emerged through magic. And I think it was after this that I began to think so much about experience, that we are always sitting outside judging human experience instead of trying to get inside the human mind and think about it as experience, more than something that happens independently of how humans think. And also, of course, narrative, because there is no paranormal encounter in the Old Norse literature. There are narratives about paranormal encounters, and the narrative changes the encounter. People have an experience, a genuine experience, but then they have to put it into words and explain it to others. And that's really what we have from the, apart from our own possible experiences, we have nothing but people telling us what they've lived. And they have these concepts like the troll, and we don't really know what they saw. So one of the encounters I talk about in this book is in the Sturlunga saga. And this is a contemporary account and fairly realistic. So it's not like an adventure tale from far ago, where you'd expect to have wondrous, weird creatures. It's an account about recent, and this is just like a regular bunch of people who go to the mountains, and there they meet a troll, and the troll is trying to circle around them. And you don't really know, because of language, if the troll is trying to get into their way or if it's trying to escape them. It's because it could mean both. Like, and this is of course the thing with language that you see every day with like emails and text messages, is that people know what they mean, and they think that the other person knows also what they mean. But then the other person gets the wrong end of the stick because language has different connotations. And obviously, like in these hurried messenger conversations, sometimes things happen in the wrong order. Like people take their time writing, and it looks like a reply to something else. And this is something you also see in the when interpreting medieval text, that there is an ambiguous phrase. But also, it is never explained what the troll is. They just see a troll. And they say mikið, like a great troll. But in what way is it great? Is it big or is it powerful? Because mikið can also mean a lot of things. And this is kind of like one of my favorite paranormal encounters in the sagas, because it's so current, it's like recent, and we don't really know anything about the troll, and language is ambiguous, and what we know is that they are startled. That's the only fact we have, that when they see the troll, they are startled, and then they die later. So possibly this is a premonition or a foreshadowing. But what we have is them being startled. Like people see something and they are startled. And I think like what I want to do is focus more on the person who sees. Like, what does the person feel? And here we have such a wonderful encounter where the main part of the tale is that people became startled. So, and I think they use the word "oh swift," so they lost their face.
Yes, right. I thought that was the story you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a very interesting phrase. You lose your face. So what does that mean? Does it mean the mask, like the mask, or does it mean that you like stopping yourself? This is also ambiguous, but it's clear that they are very frightened or in some way disturbed.
When I read that, I know the part you're talking about. I don't remember off the top of my head. What was the name of that saga?
It's in Sturlunga Saga. It happens in 1244, I think. Like it's a dated event.
So it's not the Viking Age, or it's like more contemporary.
It's more contemporary. So I think it's interesting because a lot of the narratives we have about the older period are actually very distant from the event itself. And this is one thing that people don't always understand about the Old Norse sagas, is they're definitely not contemporary tales. They are composed long after the event. And that means that even though the narratives about the event may be old, they will always have transformed in some way. So we don't really have accounts that are really close to the event.
I'm just thinking of an English saying. I don't know if you guys would say something like this, but back in the 70s when I was a young guy as a surfer, and we used to smoke a bit of marijuana, and we had a saying that you're off your face.
Yes.
If you were really ripped, really sort of lost yourself, you forgot who you were. Like, you know, I wasn't always at it, but I remember experiences where I almost couldn't remember who I was. I couldn't remember my name. I was that off my face. And when I read that there, it reminded me of sort of that. And also I've seen, when I was a policeman, I saw and sort of felt terror that's not normal, and it actually stops you being who you normally are. You sort of actually you forget who you are. It freezes your blood, and
it's that kind of experience that they're trying to put into words here. The troll is in a way secondary, because you know the main function of the troll is to startle them. And of course, we don't really know anything about the troll except it's a traditional medieval enemy. So like today it might be a UFO, like especially in the post-war period. The UFOs were the main source of people seeing something uncanny or unexplainable, unexplained, and they would cause a lot of consternation. And
Mm,
my feeling is that like UFOs are less popular now, but they may be coming back into fashion. Like there was a period, like the period when I grew up, it was so full of UFO narratives,
yeah,
and they sort of vanished from like the official discourse at least. So
yeah,
maybe people are still seeing them, but they talk less about it in public. Like what happened with mediums and psychics. Like psychics are, I'm very interested in psychics because they were so fashionable around 1900, and then
mm,
they become less fashionable. And like when I was growing up in Iceland, it was only lower class people who would talk about being interested in psychics, whereas 80 years before, it would have been the cream of society who were having Ouija boards
yeah.
and inviting psychics over. And so there's this connection between the paranormal and society that I find fascinating. Like the paranormal is such an important part of society, and it follows all kinds of rules.
Mm. Remember
The
that
rules,
you pointed me to a book by Benjamin Olshin about
yes,
ancient flying machines, and
yeah, yeah,
he actually talks about. I think he was a physicist who was really connected to Madame, is it Blavatsky or something like that, like a very popular psychic back in those early 1900s. And these were very intelligent people, but they were
yeah,
right into that. And they're
yeah.
also
Like
into pretty much what I'm interested in, is this idea of ancient civilizations that have been forgotten, ancient flying machines, ancient. Like personally, my thing that I'm interested in the Edda is that the Æsir are obviously mortal. They've got some kind of, Ithun's apples that keep them alive. As soon as Thiazi tricks Loki or blackmails Loki into letting him grab the lady, then they all start getting old and grey really fast. And that to me is quite, as because I'm getting older and greyer, I sort of can feel that, like just how horrifying it would be to go from being beautiful and 20 to suddenly being 60 something. And
they also have flying machines. Like they have eagle shapes or bird
yeah,
shapes. They can that are a kind of flying machines, and especially the one that Freya has. You can borrow it from her.
well,
So,
I just happen to have my
yeah,
Edda Snorri Sturluson from 1952 here,
yeah,
and I've got open to that page where I've just written down here, and you know these well, Freya's Valdsharmin.
yeah,
So Loki borrows that, flies to Jotunheimr. Thiazi Jotuns is out rowing a say, rowing in
yes,
the sea, and then so he grabs Ithun. Loki grabs Ithun. He puts her in a nut, Snortaliki, which my science fiction writer's imagination immediately thought like a pod, on the
yes,
side of
yeah,
the hawk-shaped craft,
yeah,
the Valsham, and flies back, and then Diazi jumps into his bigger one, the eagle shape, Arnaham. He flies after him, and I used to be an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force in the boys. It was called the Air Training Corps.
mm,
So I was obsessed with fighter aircraft and war and that sort of thing. And as I was reading this, I just could see this like a fighter battle, like
yeah,
Loki and this big Ardenham after him, and then just incredible. They come over the walls of Asgard. Loki basically does a VTOL landing. It
yeah,
says he just drops down behind the wall, and then the gods fire up something and bring him down. It's just like pop, 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 pop.
yeah,
He crashes down. They run out. They grab a hold of Thiazi and do him in. and then his daughter comes along, a bit angry about it.
But this is like also like one thing about language, like they say a knot because they're trying to get at the shape. Like shape is the knot shape, clearly.
Yeah.
Is it an actual knot or is it a metaphor? That we cannot possibly know because obviously, like actual nuts, like women
No.
are not changing into not nuts easily. So it must be a kind of way to like talk about the issue. And this is like the third thing I am focusing on in the book is also like how it's all shaped by society, like the way paranormal encounters happen is very much defined by society. And one of the things you notice is that witches are usually foreign poor people, whereas the magnates of society, they have paranormal powers, but they're not witches. They're just magnates who can shapeshift or do magic, but they don't end up being defined as the witch is an outsider by definition. So
Wow.
this is like we have actual skills, but then we have the definition of those skills. And some of the witches are like clearly professional, like they do things for money,
Yeah.
and they are punished because like they went up against the wrong people. And this is not like nobody like feels sorry for the witch. Like they are, but like this witch definition is very strong in the Middle Ages. They do use that concept to explain everything. Like
Yeah.
they do have the official religion, and that works in its own ways. And everything that's not that is some kind of magic and possibly malignant, possibly not. And there is a fuzzy middle ground between the miracles and the magic, but mostly it is an either or situation. Like, so magic is evil and it's competing with actual miracles. And you can see that for a regular person, it's sometimes hard to distinguish. Like, is the miracle worker who is working for God, is he actually a magician pretending to be a miracle worker? You know, normal people don't know this. And like the Christian saints, they come up against this, that some people think they're magicians because it's always like a matter of definition. And there's like a truth that people don't possess about these things. So this is something I find it helps being sort of located in the experience, in society, thinking about the viewer, the listener, the person who experiences the thing. Like what does it appear like to them to have a paranormal experience? The actuality of this paranormal experience is nothing that we can really find. Like it's beyond us in a way because there's this intermediary of language. Like we cannot know like what they actually saw, or if they were just like nearsighted, or if they'd had too much to drink, and you know, there's all kinds of possible explanations, but they are all beyond us. And you know, sometimes it is easy to find such an explanation, but often, and you know, that's the core of all stories of the unexplained, that sometimes people who are not drunk and have good eyesight, they see something strange too. And there's these unexplained events that you cannot really explain away, which doesn't mean that sometimes in the future we could explain it, but at the moment we cannot.
Yeah, that's why somebody like you is worth your weight in gold to us non-Icelanders who are fascinated by the subject, because we get everything through this filter of English, and my Icelandic's still lousy, but it's got a lot better over the last couple of years. And I just read all the time. I try hard. And what amazes me is that the English words that are used are often far from what the Icelandic actually is. And I wonder how Icelanders experience these things. Like the word himin, in English, it's always translated as heaven. But when I get my dictionary, it says sky, blau himin is blue sky. But for some reason, when it's applied to a god doing something, suddenly it's heaven. Yeah. Whereas for us, the word heaven is very archaic and no one ever says it. Like people don't use the word heaven unless they're specifically talking in a religious way, or they're saying this story of the gods is a myth. It's not real. That's like the God, our Christian God, heaven's real. You're supposed to believe that, at least up until fairly recently, that was supposed to be not myth. I've got a Larousse Encyclopedia of Mythology there. And I remember laughing my head off because there was this very scholarly introduction. And at the end it said, oh, but of course, we don't deal with Christianity here because it's not a myth. and I thought, oh, man, like you were made to say this. I look back and it was written in the 50s and I thought, yep, the church still had power over you back then,
This is also like this is like the traditional demarcation from the 19th century, which is another thing I'm hugely interested in, is that how the way scholars of the early 19th century defined things like myth not being Christianity because it's myth is all the other myths. Yeah. And then we are still using the same words in the same sense that they defined them, even though their beliefs may no longer be with us. And the thing about translation, and here you're approaching something that I've talked about a lot, and the translation is always an interpretation. There's no translation that's not an interpretation. And sometimes I think it's best when translators know that they are interpreting, because when they're unaware of it, they make an even bigger mess of things.
Yeah.
But there is also an issue with Icelanders, because modern Icelandic and Old Norse are quite similar, but they're not exactly the same. There is cultural difference. So there may be a lot of false friends, like words that still exist, and they're used more or less in the same fashion, but not quite in the same fashion. So the context is so important. And in a way, well, this is growing less so. It has been dangerous that Icelanders feel they understand the Eddas and Sagas easily, because sometimes they are misunderstanding them because the word is actually different. And there are different, saga language is also a language of a genre. I've often used the example of Guðrún Ósvífursdóttir, who is called Kvenna Vænst, and that is often translated as the most beautiful woman in Iceland, because Vænst is the biggest, but it doesn't mean that. It means a very beautiful woman, because they use the third, what you call it in English. I'm rusty in English.
The third person. The third person.
Not the third person, for adjectives. It's big, bigger, biggest. What do they call that? So they say biggest, but they mean bigger in a way.
Right.
And that's something that you just know when you read sagas, that it doesn't mean what it seems to mean when you just take an isolated example. So translation is a very complicated business, and in a way it's kind of good when people like you realize how little they know. Awareness of not understanding things completely is actually a good thing, because
Yes.
Sometimes people think they understand more than they actually do. Like, and they have like memorized dictionary explanations that may not be completely correct. Like sometimes the dictionary definition is based on just one example, and that means it's not very it's open to doubt. Like when we have just one instance of the word, or two or three, the meaning is less clear than when we have several, obviously. And sometimes, in most dictionary, it doesn't really say how many instances the definition is based on, but they may be, and they are sometimes a bit like dodgy, also because we have a lot of poetic language and
Mm.
words that only appear there.
Oh, yeah. And that's a whole thing that, the interpretation of kennings and,
Yes, because then we are
even
in
for you, that's difficult. For me, it's like, I've got no idea how to deal with this.
because then we are also in metaphor territory. So we don't really know, like, so the direct meaning is not really there. The kenning is like a metaphor, and the words in the kennings are a part of a metaphor. So it's kind of hard to be completely certain about. But this is like what I love about medieval literature, is that it is not always easy to understand, and that
Yeah.
you do have to spend some time on it, which you should on everything, like all meaning. Like in daily life, we are far too ready to imagine that we understand everything that's being said. But when you're dealing with medieval literature, it's kind of obvious that you don't, and you have to like think carefully about it.
I had a good laugh with my friend Simi, who's
Yeah.
a little older. I'm 66. He's 72, I think. He's Icelandic. I was speaking to him in Icelandic, and he laughed and said, "Oh, well, no, nobody talks like that anymore." And I was saying,
No.
"Thaka either fyrir."
Yeah,
He says,
yeah.
"Oh, no, nobody says either." Um,
No.
but when I'm reading the sagas, I feel at home because they use it all the time.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think my course is from 1955, so
Yes.
I say "thier."
Yeah, yeah. But that was obsolete soon after. But of course, it's a kind of Icelandic, like from the 1950s, even though it's not the language as it's spoken today. So,
Yeah, but it feels a bit closer to the saga language. I think
yeah.
being more old fashioned, more formal.
Well, Icelandic gradually grew closer to the Saga language from
Mm.
1850 to 1950, and the sagas had a lot of impact on the language, meaning that Icelandic was actually quite uh, influenced by Danish and German and other languages. And in the independence period, like when people were fighting for Icelandic independence, there was this washing of the language. So
Mm.
Old Icelandic was used as the yardstick, and people tried to like write as much like Old Icelandic as they possibly could.
Wow.
And this was quite successful, meaning that like in 1950, the gap between modern Icelandic and Old Icelandic had been bridged considerably. And possibly it's getting a bit wider again. But
Mm.
that also means that Icelanders have trouble understanding like what their grandparents wrote, because
Oh.
like because it's because they go hand in hand, like all like medieval Icelandic and 1950s Icelandic. They're quite close to each other, but it's
Ah.
way an artificial closeness. It's not because Icelandic was unchanged. It's because there was a what you call reactionary uh, language policy that wanted to go back to the medieval Icelandic as the best Icelandic.
It's a fascinating thing for me as an outsider, because you just couldn't do that with a big population. Only a land with 300,000 people
Yeah.
could do that. because here, we only got 30 million, but people would go, we're not going to change our language for some idea of, language.
But like Icelandic, like English, of course, is so big, and it's affected by English spoken in other countries, whereas Icelandic was only practiced in Iceland. But it is still an amazing accomplishment how Icelandic went back to the medieval language in such a huge degree, and we still write like the spelling still resembles the medieval language. So we are still writing like sounds that haven't been used since the 15th century.
Yeah,
this is why it's hard to learn Icelandic spelling. But if you learn it, you can also read Old Icelandic. So it comes with a bonus, you could say.
Well, I only read the sagas mostly. I don't read much modern Icelandic. I just read Old Norse, and I have no real trouble. And of course, my grammar is awful, but my friend Simi also, Simi Valgeason, he said to me, just read and read and read. So I just read the sagas, and I'm not that worried about. I'm aware that if I was an Icelander, I'd be picking up, that ending's different to what I might have used. But for me, I'm innocent. It just all seems, normal to me.
There's also a big difference in the syntax. And I think that was because like 19th century Icelanders didn't notice the syntax as much as the sounds. So they weren't so they never tried to make modern Icelandic syntax resemble medieval Icelandic. And of course, the differences are quite small in a way. But obviously, like if you came to Iceland and spoke exactly like a saga character, you would be slightly out of place.
Yeah, I keep thinking of funny things to say in Iceland that I'm sure people would go, no, that's not a word. We don't say that. I've heard that Icelanders are reluctant to speak Icelandic to somebody at my sort of level, and they like to change to English. So I've got this theory that when I come there, I will say to people, "Jeg talar enska ekki," and then they say, I say, "Jeg talar australiska." I speak Australian, mate, and we have a way of speaking that people don't understand. It's easy. I was with a group of Swedes once, and they were all drinking wine and talking at the top of their voices. And you know how Swedes really sing when they're a little bit tiddly and excited. And this other Aussie and I looked at each other and I said, mate, let's speak Aussie. So we started speaking really strong Australian with a broad accent. And then our Swedish friends eventually said, what language are you guys speaking? I said, this is our real Australian, but we don't speak like you.
Was it called Strine at some point?
Yeah. Speak Strine. I find I'm not the linguist that you are, of course, but I've always been really interested in language, and I often hear myself say things and I think, wow, that would be really hard to understand for somebody who wasn't a born Australian. We just compress everything and draw it out, squeeze it. Like even how are you going? You say, hey, gum. Hey, gum. That doesn't sound like anything. Hey, gum.
That could take a time to pick up, I guess.
Yeah, but that's how we talk to each other, especially men. We, and older men, hey, gum, mate. They say we sound like crows sitting on the fence.
And I think that it's probably applies to a degree to Icelandic too. Like Icelandic famously has no regional accents, or the regional accents are very mild. Because maybe because it was a coastal community, like people didn't live inside the country. So the language variation is less great than in Norway, for example.
Wow,
And
that's interesting.
now we
When
have social dialects, I think, that are getting bigger and bigger.
That's really interesting what you just said, because we Australians are a coastal people too.
Yeah,
We don't have much population on the interior. Most people live on the coast. It's
yeah,
very dry and hard in the interior, and
yeah,
we have very little accent difference even after 250 years.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I'm not an expert. I'm told this is something that impacts regional difference, is if like they're less in a
ah,
coastal,
how
possibly because they travel more in boats, I guess.
yeah, yeah. Could I change the subject from linguistics and ask you? I've got a couple of curly questions for you.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Please.
Gylfi and Æsir are
Mhm.
both described as wizards who go to see the Æsir, and obviously in Gylfaginning and Skullskaparmal it says that the Æsir came north and sort of taught the skills of wizardry to people. So, and I think it's later in Gylfaginning it says that when Odin sort of really like Gefjon came and ripped Gylfi off, took the land to make sea land, and then the lake filled up there, and then Odin came up and moved up. But it says that he tried to compete with Odin in wizardry, but just couldn't beat him. My question to you is, where did these guys learn wizardry before the Æsir turned up?